Okay, so I don't know how many people really know this, but as part of the new CIDER program that's funded by NSF in the FESD program. What does FESD stand for again? Frontiers something or other. Yeah, okay. There is some small amount of money for small working groups to meet. And so last year I gave a lecture on seismic attenuation at the CIDER workshop in Santa Barbara, and then afterwards some of us were talking about that, and Barbara mentioned that there is this small amount of money for these working groups to meet, and that seemed appropriate because at this time there's a lot of progress being made both in terms of improving our knowledge of the attenuation structure of the Earth by seismologists, and then also there's quite a bit of laboratory work going on to try to help us interpret these experiments. But the two communities often don't really meet very often in sort of a small setting where we can really go back and forth and exchange our knowledge of how we study the Earth's structure with people actually doing laboratory experiments that are needed to interpret those, as well as geodynamicists that want to put the constraints in their models and so forth. So we organized a small workshop. Jeff Abers, Ved Lekic, Ben Holtzman, and myself organized a small meeting of this working group or workshop at Lamont this May. And we had it at Lamont because the money for these workshops is relatively limited. Then we want to choose a place where many people can drive. It turns out there's a big epicenter of this kind of work on the East Coast, like at Brown University and so forth. And so a lot of the people could drive and we could minimize costs. And then we had keynote talks Ian Jackson was supposed to give one, but then there was a medical thing, so Uli Fowle gave it, Yatsuko Takei, and Colleen Dalton. And altogether there were about 30 people present. And the idea was basically to go back and forth between the seismic results, what can we say seismically, and then what can the experimental community tell us in terms of how to interpret these measurements. And just to kind of give a little bit of background here, because I know a lot of you are not in either rock deformation or in seismology, why should we care about seismic attenuation? What is it good for besides giving seismologists and rock deformation people something to do? So basically the idea is in a perfectly elastic medium, the total energy of the wave field would be conserved. So perfectly elastic medium is like if you drop a rubber ball, it hits the ground and it goes back up to the same height it started from. Okay, well that doesn't really happen, of course, in the real Earth. And that's because some energy is always absorbed. And so seismic attenuation is essentially the absorption of seismic energy or the deviation from perfect elasticity. The reason why we're really interested in this is that seismic attenuation will have a different dependence on things in the Earth that we're interested in, like temperature or partial melt or composition, compared to seismic velocity. So that, therefore, if we can add seismic attenuation to our sort of bag of observables that we can come up with for, say, the deep in the mantle or something, then we can better constrain some of these parameters in the Earth. For example, in most cases we think that seismic attenuation is less sensitive to composition but more sensitive to temperature compared to seismic velocity. So then it makes a good, if we can sort of then add that to our constraints, we'll better be able to constrain these properties. And so just to give you an idea of sort of the obvious observations here, this is basically surface waves after a large earthquake over about 9 hours here from stations all around the world. So the earthquake would be at distance 0, and 180 degrees is exactly opposite point on the Earth. And so after the earthquake, you see the surface waves, I think these are Rayleigh waves, go all the way to the antipode, and then they come back to the to the source, and then they go to the antipode again. So you can imagine a globe, and the surface wave spreading out, focusing at the antipode, spreading out, going back to where the earthquake occurred, and so forth. But the point is that this energy fades out. So we don't record surface waves from earthquakes that were a week ago. I guess we do modes sometimes, but not surface waves. So, the seismic attenuation basically reduces that energy over time. And the same thing happens with body waves. Here is another example. So, basically, after a large earthquake, then we have S waves that go and they hit the core mantle boundary. And if they're SH waves, they're completely reflected. And so you can have S waves that are just going back and forth between the core mantle boundary and the Earth's surface. And so, this is the first bounce, and SCS2 is the second bounce, and SCS3 is the third bounce, and so forth. But the point is that the energy or the amplitude is decreasing, and that's because the Earth absorbs the seismic energy, the attenuation of the Earth. Now, we quantify the seismic attenuation using this quality factor term. And so this is kind of an analogy to the damped harmonic oscillator, underdamped case, where we have the simple differential equation, and we have a solution which is this negative exponential, which has this decaying amplitude, which is a function of this parameter q. And so we talk about seismic q, and the attenuation is then 1 over q. So it's one of these parameters that's a 1 over parameter, which makes it a little bit confusing sometimes. But basically, a smaller q results in faster damping or more attenuation. Another thing to notice is that just because of this negative exponential term and the fact that you have frequency in that, means that high-frequency waves are attenuated or lose their energy faster than low-frequency waves. And that's even for when Q is frequency independent. So later on I'll talk about a frequency-dependent Q. That doesn't mean the high-frequency losing more energy than low-frequency doesn't rely on the frequency-dependent Q. It even happens, or it happens just with a frequency-independent Q. But a frequency-dependent Q would also then have Q being a function of frequency, and obviously that complicates things more. Okay, so another thing to remember, and this is where rock deformation comes in, is that basically seismic attenuation results from the time dependence of the rheological response. So that if we imagine the Earth's response to be something like this Burger's vector here, or this Burger's system, and we apply this kind of stress step to the Earth or to our sample. Okay, immediately when we apply the stress step, we'll have a certain response. Okay, and that's the elastic response. Okay, and that gives us this elastic compliance. So elastic modulus is 1 over that, and then over time, then we'll have the response of this anelastic part, okay, which gives us this time-dependent creep function, okay, so then ultimately, when that finally becomes steady state, then we have the relaxed compliance, which is actually larger than the elastic compliance, so that the modulus is therefore smaller. Okay, and where the seismic part comes in is you can imagine, exciting this with either low frequency or high frequency waves. Okay, so that basically, if you excite this with really high frequency waves, this anelastic part has no chance to respond. So all we see is the elastic part, and so all we see is essentially the elastic modulus. But if we excite this one with very low frequency waves, then depending on how low frequency the wave, the excitation is, we're going to partially or completely excite, this anelastic response. If it's a very, very low frequency wave, then we'll just see the relaxed compliance. Okay, and so basically, This is then the way that seismic velocity is actually frequency dependent. And seismic velocity, the frequency dependence of seismic velocity actually does depend on the attenuation or on the anelasticity. So it's not the case that seismic velocity is completely independent of seismic attenuation. There is this relationship, but the seismic attenuation senses the Earth somewhat differently than seismic velocity. Now going to, so that's kind of the background really quick about why we care about seismic attenuation and why it's good for you. And now going to some of the things that we saw at the workshop. This is showing some recent attenuation models. This is modeled by Colleen Dalton and others. And the point is we're now able to come up with really relatively good-looking global models of seismic attenuation, and ones that have a correspondence of features that we think we should see, like high attenuation beneath mid-ocean ridges and low attenuation, for example, beneath some continental cratons. Actually has a fairly good correspondence to seismic velocities. And so then we can look at how the seismic attenuation and seismic velocities are related. And this is a figure also from Colleen's work showing that how the seismic attenuation and seismic velocity is related for different parts of the world. For basically old continents is in green here, and in oceans are in red, and so forth, defining these fields in this plot. And then also there's some extrapolations of experimental results from Fowle and Jackson about what we should expect if all these variations in both velocity and attenuation are due to temperature variations. And you can see that maybe to sort of zeroth order it provides some sort of fit, but then there's sort of interesting variations from that may be telling us something about how the different factors are affecting seismic attenuation and seismic velocity. I'm just going through a few things that we saw at the workshop here, starting with some of the seismology things. One of the kind of really interesting things is we can people can now invert for seismic attenuation using some of these advanced numerical techniques. So this is a spectral element method that Huron Trump and others have been using to get high-resolution images of the Earth. And now they have put in the seismic attenuation properly into these spectral element method, and then they can use the edge-joint inversion techniques to invert simultaneously thousands of waveforms. I think this is something like nearly 20,000 waveforms from like 800 stations across Europe to get new attenuation models. These are some of these attenuation models that he and Zhu and Huron Trump showed at the meeting, which have a lot higher resolution than any previous seismic attenuation models for this area. And they also show quite high attenuation in the transition zone, which is a little bit surprising to me, and if it holds up will be quite an interesting aspect.
Receiver station distribution is this based on? Why are there these lines?
Oh, the lines there are just showing the profile. So, yeah, so N1 is a profile going across, from Iceland over to Scandinavia, I guess, and N3 is this long profile along this way. But they're using, I think, all the earthquakes that are in this entire region shown here, and then they're using stations, broadband seismic stations that are distributed throughout Europe, something like 700 or 800 of them. So, you could just cut the model however you want. It's a three-dimensional model, and this is just showing three slices through it.
Doug, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is this the first time that the high attenuation and the transition zone has been imaged? And then secondly, what was the discussion at the workshop about why That's true.
Well, I'd have to think about whether people have found high attenuation in the transition zone before. The work that I'm familiar with didn't really find that kind of high attenuation in the transition zone before.
The model that we built 10 years ago has lateral variations in attenuation in the transition zone, which correlate with a very long wavelength, which correlate with the seismic structure at the base of the mantle, the two LLNDPs. But it's, it depends what you mean by high attenuation. We don't have much control on the actual amplitude of the attenuation. We just can tell that it's higher attenuation in the Pacific and Africa than in the...
Well, I'm just looking at the red versus the green part.
But it doesn't look like this at all.
Yeah, what was surprising to me is that the transition zone has as high of an attenuation. It's a little bit hard to tell because it's saturated there, but it looks like it has nearly as high attenuation as you get in the asthenosphere, which I think...
There's one other model that shows a zone of high attenuation in the transition zone or in the top of the lower mantle by Jesse Lawrence.
Right. Well, I think that was more in the top of the lower mantle, though, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, that's going to be depends on geographically, depends on where you are. If you have a stagnant slab, it's not going to look like that.
Well, I think there was another figure that Huron Trump showed there, and he thought that a lot of the high attenuation was concentrated near where the slabs were.
Really?
And he thought it had something to do with water in the transition zone. But then there was some discussion because Don Forsyth also showed some results from the Western Pacific that did not show high attenuation in the transition zone.
I think these are preliminary results.
Yeah.
They need to be tested.
Yeah, so I mean, this is like not published or even submitted yet. So thanks to Jerome Trump for letting me show it, and don't criticize him too much.
Is it a problem if we put this on the web?
Well, he didn't say anything. I can ask him, though, if you want. It's only one figure, but we should probably ask. And just going to subduction zones, which is, this is some work that one of my students did, and this is some work that Karen Fisher and Jeff Avers' student Kate Reichert did on subduction zones. And we do see sort of really high attenuation in the regions beneath the volcanic arc, and in the Mariana case, also beneath the back arc spreading center. And if we think about where we would be thinking of that melt would be generated in these systems, and this is some work by Katie Kelly et al., looking at the magma equilibration or the last equilibration depth from thermobarometry. The magma equilibration depths for the back arc spreading center would be something like 20 to 40 kilometers deep. And we know from like the talk this morning that the magma would generally be produced at depths from 70 to 20 or so kilometers deep. So it looks like the really high attenuation region here corresponds pretty well to where we would expect magma to be produced beneath the Mariana back arc spreading center. And then also the highest attenuation beneath the arc is also in a region that we would be expecting magma to be generated. And Katie Kelly's magma equilibration depths there are like 35 to 90 kilometers deep, and that matches pretty well what we're seeing. So there's some evidence here, at least circumstantial evidence, that attenuation may be able to provide constraints on the melt generation process, and maybe ultimately, if we can interpret it properly, on things like porosity, how much melt is actually there, which would be very useful in helping us understand how melt is actually, how the melting process happens and how melt is transported. Yeah?
Do you know if the attenuation is anisotropic?
Oh. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have to, as seismologists, tell people is that attenuation is not nearly as easy to measure as seismic velocity. And so, therefore, we're making a lot of progress, we think, in getting sort of isotropic attenuation models. Theoretically, attenuation should be anisotropic, but I think right now we'd have a very much over-parameterized problem if we really tried to look for it. At least I wouldn't want to do that. So, maybe 20 years from now or something.
I'm sure we did for a process anisotropic.
Yeah. Okay, so going on to the experiments then. This is how some of the experiments at least are carried out, kind of the idea behind them. They are very difficult experiments to do, which is why they haven't really been done until the last 10 or 20 years. And basically the idea is you need to do the experiments at seismic frequencies in order to really measure seismic attenuation, because we expect the attenuation to be frequency dependent. And so some very old work that was done like in ultrasonic frequencies probably really doesn't apply to the seismic case. And so what most labs do, and there's only a very few labs that actually do these kind of experiments, is that you have to apply a torsional stress at a certain frequency to the rock specimen and an elastic standard here, and then measure the amount of strain that results, at various frequencies from this oscillation. And then from this we can measure both the shear modulus as a function of frequency and the attenuation, which attenuation is actually a phase lag in the strain, and we can measure that as a function of frequency then at various temperatures and whatever parameters we want to vary. And of course it gets more difficult as you try to demand more of the experimentalists, like asking them about melt and things like that. So anyhow, that's kind of the idea behind these experiments. And a lot of these experiments have been done in the Ian Jackson's lab at ANU by Ian Jackson and also by Uli Fowle. And basically they find a strong dependence of attenuation on grain size. And so here we see attenuation here as a function of temperature and also grain size. And one of the problems here is that the laboratory experiments have to be done on very small samples, and so they have to be done at very, very small grain sizes. And so then in order to really understand what's happening in the mantle, we have to extrapolate over quite a few orders of magnitude in grain size in order to really understand what's happening in the mantle. So in this case, you don't see the actual observations, but the observations were done sort of in this region up here, and in these other lines here are extrapolations over a wide, several orders of magnitude in grain size. And here it's at two different periods. I guess and so this is they first had some results in about 2002, and now they have a sort of a somewhat revised set of relationships. And they interpret, because of the strong grain size dependence, they interpret the deformation mechanism or the attenuation mechanism as being due to grain boundary sliding, and that's why the grain size is very important. But one thing that we discussed at the workshop from their most recent results that seems kind of a little bit strange is they have an absorption band in the sort of, well, it comes out sort of in the lower temperature, large grain size area, so that there are actually cases where as temperature goes up, the attenuation goes down for certain grain sizes and certain temperatures. So this is one feature of their latest relationships that they show that seems a little bit different and can cause some sort of unusual results. Unfortunately, it causes some kind of a little bit unusual results across kind of periods of temperature and so forth that we care about. Yeah.
Sorry, what is the maximum pressure at which they can arrive with these experiments?
I think these are well, it says 0.2 GPa. So they're done under pressure, but relatively low pressures. and then they extrapolate them also using a volume extrapolation to depth. So basically, that's another issue, is the experiments are really not done over a wide range of pressures either, and so the pressure dependence has to be done also by an extrapolation. A different approach is taken by and of course I'm not a rock deformation person, so I'm showing stuff here that I don't really know that much about. A different approach is taken by the Tokyo group, Yatsuko Takei, and they've done most of their experiments here on analog substances. There's the substance borneol that actually melts at laboratory temperatures, which makes it convenient to study things like the effect of melt. And what they found is that they can get their borneol results and also everybody else's olivine results to agree along this master curve, basically by normalizing or scaling all the observations by the Maxwell frequency, which is Young's modulus over the diffusion creep viscosity of the material. And so this was in this paper by Christine McCarthy a couple of years ago. And it really promises to perhaps give us a different or alternative scaling for looking at some of these parameters. But the problem is that in normalized frequency, where these things all agree, is a lower frequency than where seismic would scale in terms of Maxwell frequency. So you sort of really need more experiments at higher normalized frequencies in order to really directly compare with seismic frequencies. And one of the interesting things at the workshop was Takei gave her most recent results, and actually the curve starts to break down a little bit as you get close to the seismic band, because apparently there's another mechanism contributing additional attenuation. And so all the curves don't exactly lie on each other as you extrapolate them out, according to her very most recent results. So that's sort of also some ongoing work there, though, to see whether that approach will be successful. Okay, well, that's kind of a general background, and then just to kind of cover the things that really generated discussion, and this is actually the points that were on our slide for the last afternoon of the workshop, the things that we really kind of had a lot of discussion about. And that was the really nice thing about this small workshop, is you have only 20 or 30 people there, so and sort of experts in these fields, and you can have a lot of talking back and forth. So the questions are how to extrapolate from the lab to the seismic grain size. Talking a little bit about that already. How much does melt matter? So can we say something about the effects of melt? How much do dislocations matter? There's a paper, I think, in Science this last year on dislocation and its effect on attenuation. And in the seismologists among the group talked a lot about this question: do we see frequency dependence in seismic data? When we go from sort of really high frequency observations at local or regional body waves all the way out to normal modes, do we see significant frequency dependence? Bulk attenuation. So in general, we associate, we generally think of all the attenuation as being associated with the shear modulus. So P waves have attenuation, but it's the attenuation that's associated with the shear modulus. But it's possible that there's additional attenuation that's associated with the bulk modulus. It's usually thought to be negligible, but it may not be. So that's another question. And then there was sort of an argument among seismologists about what Q do we observe under ridges and in the asthenosphere. Just to highlight a couple of these arguments. So the question is, how well do we extrapolate from the lab to mantle grain size? And so this is a plot that Jeff Abers made of sort of the direct measurements of these different labs. Well, there's two different relationships here from Fowle and Jackson, and then there's Christine McCarthy's and Yutsuko Takei's result. And they all agree really very well, sort of at the lab grain size. So this is, very, very small grain size in the laboratory scale. But when we take their actual relationships that they propose based on the attenuation mechanisms that they propose, and then scale this to sort of what we would want to, what we think we see in the mantle. So grain size is here like 0.5 centimeter, and frequencies that we observe in the mantle body wave period and surface wave period. Then we kind of get a mess, and the observations or the different curves no longer are compatible at all. You can see the green one there is the most recent Fowle and Jackson model, where you get actual decreases in attenuation as you raise the temperature over certain periods. So I think this is sort of a problem that we were kind of pointing out to the experimental community, that those of us that are trying to actually apply these relationships to the mantle, don't see very much agreement in these extrapolations, and that's because there's some disagreement, I think, about the actual mechanism of the attenuation. So this is something that I think needs to be discussed more. That was really brought out at this workshop.
So if you go back to Colleen-Dalton's scatter plot, would any of those newer theoretical curves work better?
Well, that would be interesting to try. I don't think Colleen has done that. Actually, I mean, the Fowle and Jackson 2010 is it's kind of a relatively similar, but it is a change because of this additional peak from their 2005 one. Her paper used the Fowle and Jackson 2005. I don't think that this absorption band there is going to help much in interpreting her results. And in Takei's results, McCarthy and Takei, I don't know what that would do to her plot.
For the surface waves, I guess you don't get that as much. And there's a change in the slope.
Yeah.
So did Fowle and Jackson talk about why big grains behave so differently?
What? Well, basically the the grain size dependence comes in because the actual absorption mechanism is grain boundary sliding according to their fits. But this absorption band there, they attribute to a particular absorption band associated with a particular deformation mechanism. And I forget the details exactly, but that you have to look in their 2010 paper. Going on to the effect of melt fraction, I'll try to wrap up here real quickly. Basically, both labs show that the effect of melt the very large effect of melt comes with the initial small fraction, so that if you just put in just a drop of melt into the problem, then you immediately change the attenuation by a fairly significant amount. However, the parameter, how much of a variation you get and how that varies with temperature is quite different. So, here for the Tokyo lab results, you see the dry line, and then you see with 0.1% and 1% melt. So there's almost no difference between 0.1% and 1% melt, but they do have a significant difference from the dry case. For Fowle and Jackson's results, once again, you have several different dry curves, but then the 0.1% and the 1% melt curves are not that different either. So you get this huge difference with even 0.1% melt, and then not much difference after that. But the ANU lab results have this huge temperature dependence, so that if you have melt and you have a significant, mantle potential temperature, you're going to see like this very large amount of attenuation using Fowle and Jackson results. And basically, using this result, we have no trouble getting the observed attenuation, say, beneath the Mariana back arc spreading center with a very small amount of melt. So, which would make some geochemists happy that deal with uranium series disequilibria and so forth and like to see very little in situ melt in the mantle. It's a little bit harder to get enough attenuation out of the melt with the Tokyo results. Last thing I can talk about is frequency dependence of attenuation. This is kind of an argument among us seismologists who were there at the meeting. Basically, going back even quite a number of years, we see some evidence here at higher frequencies for frequency dependence of Q. And we parameterize it by this number alpha, which is attenuation as a function of frequency is a function of f to the minus alpha. And the experiments, like Fowle and Jackson, suggest about 0.3 or 0.27 for alpha. And although the observations are not very clear, they are consistent with that kind of exponent. In this case, I would ignore these points because they sample over a much larger area than the higher frequency observations. This is another body wave study by Jeff Aber's student and in Alaska, where they solved for the best fitting alpha out of this larger data set, and they got the best fit for an alpha of 0.4, which is also rather consistent with the laboratory data. But then going to sort of lower frequencies, there is some evidence. There's a study by Ved Lekic, where I've kind of edited his slide a little bit here. But basically, there is evidence that this trend probably turns around and even maybe has the opposite slope as you get to extremely long period or extremely low frequencies. So, if you look at this, all this data together, I think we would conclude that there is some variation in the frequency dependence, over the seismic band. It's not clear how well resolved it is. And I think I'm running over time, so I'll just leave this up there. I think we found this workshop to be very helpful, and those of you that are generating interesting questions here, you could think of talking to the CIDER steering committee or whatever about the possibility of having a working group meeting like this.
At that meeting, did you guys talk about crustal attenuation? This is mostly mantle.
Yeah, I think we focused more on the mantle attenuation. We didn't deal very much with crustal attenuation, which might be due to things like scattering and cracks and so forth.
You don't expect much scattering here?
Well, at the longer periods, we probably don't have that much scattering. And also, the thing is, I think the scattering is negligible when you get to high temperatures because the intrinsic attenuation is so large. We also didn't really talk that much about core like inner core attenuation. Yeah.
So realizing that anisotropic attenuation is not something you want to work on, what were some of the big questions you left with at the end?
Well, I think it was basically the questions that we had on this slide here. I think, can we come up with a good way to extrapolate to the seismic grain size? And, can we parameterize the effect of melt? We didn't even talk about it very much, but another looking question is the effect of water. Water absorbed in the crystal structure. So this kind of covers the real issues, I think, that we had.
And so here you talk about the frequency dependency of the Q. How about, at one point you might think about the relaxed and unrelaxed modulus. So is there any sort of result on that?
Well, if you know Q and you know its frequency dependence, then you can compute the difference between the relaxed and unrelaxed modulus. so that you could correct seismic observations for variations in frequency. If you have seismic observations at different frequencies, you can compare them directly if you can correct for the for that effect.
For the range of variation of the Q, depends on the frequency. So what would be the percentage difference for relaxed and unrelaxed, let's say, shear modulus?
Yeah, it totally depends on the amount of attenuation. So if you have a large amount of attenuation, you have a large difference in the relaxed and unrelaxed.
I guess you showed some of the, the frequency you look at. There are some variation in Q. There is even scanning for that. So what would be?
I think the variations are sort of on the order of a few percent. I don't know. Somebody like Barbara might have a better comment. The difference between the relaxed and unrelaxed modulus, what differences does it cause, say, between 100-second shear wave velocity and 1-second shear wave velocity?
It's in terms of percent?
Yeah, it's a few percent.
About 3 or 4%?
3 or 4%, yeah.
In the velocity zone,
yeah. No, Barbara, I think we should get to your talk, so we have time before the bus comes.
So, did you have this on, by the way? Okay. Okay. So, Thorsten asked me to report on the other working group activities. How do I make this? Which I participated in. This was a working group which had a workshop in late April of this year. It was organized by Ved Lekitz of University of Maryland, and it was about developing a 3D seismic reference Earth model. The report actually is posted on the wiki. CIDER. Because this was a last-minute request, I didn't have much time to prepare, so I asked Ved to send me his slides, and I slightly modified them, but so I'd like to acknowledge that he provided. So the first question is, why aren't we satisfied with 1D models? Give a little bit of the motivation. We have several seismic whole Earth 1D models that work well. The PREM model in particular, which dates back to 1981, is still used as an excellent reference model. There are two other models, AK135 and EASP91, that are also used. The PREM is used preferentially for long period work in seismology, and the other two for body waves. So, for example, AK135 works very well for core phases, to predict the travel times of core phases. But, okay, so there are some issues, such as just the way these models were constructed. Because of the uneven distribution of earthquake and seismic stations, the models that were based on the shorter period body waves, the travel times of body waves, of course, because of the distribution of stations, they are biased towards continental structure. So if you want to use them as global averages, you have to be a little careful. And then models like PREM, which were based on normal modes, which sort of average the structure naturally, they don't fit travel times as accurately as do these other models. So introducing 3D Earth structure, which is the cause for these differences, for these problems, would help alleviate that particular problem. If you had a 3D reference model, you would have an average still as part of it, a 1D average, which would still be useful. Okay, so I guess these are slides from VED. And so another motivation, well, very specifically for the PREM model, as many of you perhaps know, PREM has embedded in it a discontinuity at 220 kilometers. This is the place where PREM is an anisotropic model, radially anisotropic down to 220 kilometers. And this discontinuity is actually not a global feature. And it causes all sorts of problems when you try to use this model to model the upper mantle. Another important motivation, though, for a 3D reference model is that the 1D reference does not necessarily has any physical meaning. That is, if you want to confront this model with mineralogy, with mineral physics, this may not make sense because there is lateral variations, and the lateral variations in composition, and what you get out of an average model is an average of some composition which may not actually exist, right? So, and another problem with the existing 1D models is that there are no uncertainties attached, and it would be nice to have that feature. So, oops. So the next question is, we have quite a few models, 3D Earth models, 3D mantle models that are based on tomographic work, but there is still the fact that there isn't any of these models that would be consistent with all of the seismic data sets that we have, the normal mode frequencies, the long period surface wave dispersion, travel times of even long period P&S waves, and the other constraints such as mass of the Earth and moment of inertia. And if we wanted to, I'm not sure why he put this in here. I guess the number of parameters that we have in the current 3D models, if you use all of the parameters, is too large to explore uncertainties. But anyway, So there was a workshop held at University of Maryland to answer the following: if we are to have a reference 3D model, what should it include? What are the parts? What are the important parts of 3D variations that we want to capture and that we feel comfortable that they are robust at this point? So is 3D mantle structure known well enough to warrant the development of a 3D reference Earth model, and to what extent, to what wavelength actually is the question. Okay, oops. What is this? I was probably, okay. Are the amplitude of velocity variations retrieved with sufficient fidelity that they would be representative in a reference model? And also, this, there is the criteria of the seismologist, but what other criteria should this reference Earth model have that it would be useful for others than seismologists, in particular the mineral physicists and the geodynamicists? So this workshop was attended by about 20 people, mostly seismologists, but we had representatives from the mineral physics community: Uli Faul, Brent Groholski, Sash Majumdar, I guess, and Don Widener were there. So just as a background, for those of you that don't do global models every day, this is sort of a view of slices of the structure, long wavelength structure through the Earth, which shows some of the major of the features that are well documented and at least qualitatively representative of all the models. The region at the top of the mantle, which correlates with tectonics. As you go deeper, the picture changes, and you start seeing the subduction zones here. in blue, the fast velocities and subductions and slow velocities in between. As you go deeper into the mantle, this signature also starts to disappear with only some zones remaining blue. And then one of the sort of most striking features in these models is that when you get to the bottom of the mantle, you see this long wavelengths, well-structured features with the two large low shear velocity provinces under the Pacific and under Africa, more or less equatorial, with a ring of fast velocities around them. And if you take the spectrum, so the spatial spectrum, the wavelengths, the different wavelengths of the models as a function of depths, and large energy will be red here, and blue would be no energy. This is as a function of angular degree in a spherical harmonics expansion. If you don't know what it is, it doesn't matter. This means the longest wavelengths are on this side, the shortest wavelengths on this side. And you see that the spectrum is very red at the bottom of the mantle, which is reflected in these very long wavelength structures, and it's quite long wavelengths also at the top, on the top boundary layer, which reflects the continent versus ocean and young ocean versus old ocean structure. So there are things that are well established. The details vary from model to model. Here are some examples of different recent models at depths of upper mantle depth 100 kilometers. This is shear velocity, and you can see that even in some of the details, the models do agree. There is quite a lot of agreement with this. There's some disagreement, perhaps, in the amplitude of lateral variation still among these models, but the features are quite well. So, and in the lowermost mantle, this is a comparison of maps from different groups also at 2,800 kilometers depth, I believe, showing the same kind of long wavelength features with some of the details varying from model to model. This actually is actually raw data. These are waves. These are travel times of waves that are reflected at the core mantle boundary, which are plotted at the bounce point at the core mantle boundary, and they're referred to direct S waves, and you can see that this structure actually is visible in the data themselves. So these are pretty robust features. So going quickly to the 3D REM workshop, there was a lot of discussion of, what we should do, whether it was made sense to develop a 3D REM model. The conclusion was that yes, the development of a 3D REM or a REM 3D model is justified by the excellent agreement among tomographic models at long wavelengths. And the general consistency also, we discussed a lot the data sets about among the available long period seismic data set. We also discussed, a complete elastic model or a complete model would have the three elastic parameters, so the shear velocity, the compressional velocity, the density, and then also attenuation. The easiest to constrain globally at long wavelengths is the shear velocity structure, but we also should try to constrain VP and density. And for the mineral physicist, an important parameter is the both modulus and its depth derivative. It would be very useful. Another aspect of this is that the models themselves are not the model itself, whatever it is that we come up with, is not sufficient, but we should also develop a sort of a reference set of seismic data sets that were used in the construction and later in the validation of the model, so that people can actually use these data sets on their own. And yes, and then, of course, we want to introduce uncertainties, so quantification of uncertainties into this reference model. So another thing we discussed is the parametrization, and we concluded that we would actually present this model in two flavors. One would be a regionalized model, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, what the motivation for this is, if I still have time. The idea would be to regionalize the model in the upper mantle into 6 regions, and I'll explain why. So in the upper mantle, and then in the lower mantle, the 2 regions. The 2 regions in the lower mantle, you can well imagine, are the 2 regions, the low velocity in the LLSVPs, and then the higher velocities outside. This regionalization reflects the tectonic regionalization, which is a good, which you can see very well in the structure down to about 200 kilometers depth, 200, 250. And at depths greater than that, the lateral variations in velocity become smaller anyway, so the reference model does not have to be, it really doesn't matter what regionalization you use. So the reason for this regionalization is that in this case, you end up with fewer parameters. You have 6 regions in the upper mantle, 2 in the lower mantle, as a function of depth. And so this would be very useful also from the mineral physics point of view, to associate these profiles with particular mineralogies. On the other hand, it's not very practical for other applications, such as actually using this model as a reference model for computing the wave field, the seismic wave field through it, because it would have these somewhat artificial boundaries. It wouldn't be very useful either for geodynamic modeling. So the other way to present it would be a smooth parametrization, as we are used to doing, which is expansions into the spherical harmonics, which is the natural basis on the sphere for expansion. And we agreed that in the upper mantle, degree 12 would be the appropriate wavelength, and degree 6 in the lower mantle. So this would be longer wavelength in lower mantle than in the upper mantle. Degree 12 corresponds to about 2,000 kilometers wavelength. Am I right? Somebody correct me, because I'm tired.
The diameter is 25,000.
Yes. Okay. Right. So that's fine. It's about that. Okay. And these curves show you, the number of how much of the variance you can explain in models, depending on whether you expand in spherical harmonics or using this regionalization based on clustering. So I have 5 minutes left. So the basis for this regionalization is actually, I find kind of cool, which is you can regionalize the model. So what I'm going to show is just an example. This is between 30 kilometers and 300 kilometers depth, where you take at each point of the model, at each geographical location, you take the profile. It's a vector of velocity variation, and you associate these vectors. You compare these vectors to one another using some distance measure to see whether they're similar or not. And this is called clustering analysis, and if you decide that you want to have 2 families, you specify that you want 2 families, and you run this, and you then see the distribution of these 2 families. And if you do this, this is Ved's model that he published in 2011. If you do that, but you can do this with other models, you find more or less the ocean-continent distribution. If you decide you want 3 regions, you see young oceans versus old oceans versus continents. 4 regions, you start seeing the active, sort of stable versus active tectonic regions on the continents. 5 regions, you see an extra zone in the oceans. I don't have time to speak about it very much. I like this one because with 6 regions, you start seeing the cratons quite nicely here. And then, so this actually is the regionalization that you can come up with. Now, each of these regions, of course, is composed of a number of vectors, and so you can, just by looking at this, you can get some idea of the standard deviation for one region or another. So the set, Yes, the set of average VS profiles for each region summarizes the tomographic model, not perfectly, of course, because the structure does change with depth, starts decorrelating with the tectonic regions at 200 kilometers. Yes, so anyway, you can read this. And then in the lowermost mantle, just cluster analysis with just 2 regions. This, I don't have time to explain what this is, but this is comparing different models and basically showing how consistent the different models, tomographic models from different groups are between each other. And it's quite amazing how well they actually agree even on the boundaries of these LLSVPs. So, okay. So the regionalization approach will allow us to have fewer parameters, to have a way of presenting the model that will be useful to mineral physicists, and also will allow to apply model space search techniques, nonlinear Bayesian inference, to estimate uncertainties, which is nice. And so recommendations, we created 3 working groups to advise, oversee, and evaluate the reference model development and its reconciliation of different reference data set, which consists of surface wave dispersion, normal frequencies, and splitting functions. Don't have time to explain that. Body wave travel times, depth of discontinuities, density contrast, VPVS, physical parametrization informed by constraints from mineral physics, like optimal scaling factors for presently seismically unresolved parameters. Okay, I mean, I don't have too much time to explain. So crustal structure is an important, we discussed that, it's a very important part of this, because the crust is the most heterogeneous part of the Earth, and it affects all of the waves. We talked about the core, so outer core 1D, and then we maybe include inner core anisotropy in REM 3D, at least consider it. Radial anisotropy in the upper mantle is a very important, it's a very important signal in the long period data, so it needs to be included. But azimuthal anisotropy, we felt were not ready to include it. It still is not as well resolved. 220 kilometer discontinuity should not be imposed, and we would develop a tool to quantify the compatibility of these different profiles of these different parameters with the reference seismic data set, and of course evaluate the potential of this REM 3D long period model for predicting higher frequency waves, such as are used for earthquake location, for example, by the International Seismological Center. And okay, we're done. And so I want to show you my view of the formation of the lithosphere. Just before we go, I was doing some experiments last night. Oh, it doesn't work. QuickTime not available. Sorry. We'll have to do it some other time. But you can see the idea. I was making jam yesterday. Okay, I don't know if you have any questions. We have to rush, or we can talk later. Yes?
Can you imagine this model will evolve with time?
The what?
Will it evolve with time, or is it fixed?
It can certainly evolve as the data sets, yes, there's no reason why we couldn't evolve it. We'll develop the tools that will allow this. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mark?
Barbara, the crux in cluster analysis, and in my small experience, is understanding physically what each cluster means. So as you increase the number of clusters,
yes,
it's easy to understand physically what each cluster actually means.
Well, I mean, I was hoping that I would have demonstrated that they reflect the tectonic structure without having put the tectonic structure, there's no a priori. So this is valid only for the uppermost mantle, of course. You have to, be careful. But it means that the tectonics really are reflected very well in the velocity structure down to 200 kilometers.
So for that cluster
just use one model and divide it by different group of different velocity, would you see the same structures?
You mean if you did this for other models?
Just for one model.
So this is for one model. This was for one model, right? I showed example for just one model. But if you did it for other models, you would see very similar. You would find a very similar result.
You see the same regionalization.
Yes, you see the same regionalization. I mean, I have a biased view because I'm an author on this model, and I would say, with all the caveats, that this one brings out the tectonic structures more cleanly than some of the other models. That is, there's no, the color that you see in the continents doesn't spread into the oceans and vice versa. In some of the other models, you have a little bit more, kind of spread. But you do see the same. Yeah, you definitely see it. And there's no geological information involved in there.
So the vector is VP and VS?
The vector is VS, just VS. These are all shear velocity. Yes, I don't have time to talk about VP, but the problem with VP, it's constrained by normal mode data, which are only the very, very longest wavelengths, and by travel times, which are biased. And so we have to devise some way of taking this. We will do it sequentially. First VS, and then VP, and then rho, which is even more difficult to constrain.